Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we will be discussing China's experiences in the 19th century. This is the second in a series of videos on the 19th century. So in this video, we will answer the big question of what problems were faced by the Chinese in the 19th century and how ultimately did they respond to these problems. And you should be able to start to draw some comparisons between what was similar about China and Japan's response to industrialization in the 19th century and what was ultimately different. So the last time we were in China, in period 4, we were describing the rise of the Qing Dynasty following the collapse of the Ming. The Qing were foreigners, they were the Manchus, they had invaded China from the north. And we also described how during both the Ming and then into the Qing Dynasty, the Chinese were increasingly interested in silver as a global trade commodity. As we move into period 5 and the Industrial Revolution takes place, we start to see Britain and other industrialized powers seeing China as this emerging market to sell these new manufactured goods. These industrializing nations were oftentimes producing surplus goods in their factories, and they needed people to sell them to, and what better place than a place where there's lots of people, which is China. But China was always a little bit reluctant to buy goods from outsiders. And that was still the case in 1793 when the Qing Emperor wrote a letter to King George of England telling him, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance. There is no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians." And so it's at this time that China really begins to limit their trade with European nations. They established what's known as the Canton system in order to regulate the flow of European imports into China. And so this should sound familiar to you, right? This sounds similar to what the Japanese were doing with their isolationist policies, only allowing the Dutch to trade for 1 week out of the year. Now, the Japanese took this to sort of another level, but the Chinese were trying to limit and restrict and regulate the flow of European trade as part of this Canton system in the 1700s. Now, by the 1800s, the Qing are going to experience a pretty steady, significant decline. There's really one significant reason for this. The Chinese, by this point, are still a society and economy that is based on agriculture. They're a traditional agrarian society. But, as you can see in this graph, their population is increasing rapidly. And that's a result of exposure to new American foods and better nutrition. And so when you add those two things up, you have this increase in population, but you don't have industrialization. You still have this traditional agrarian society. What you end up with is a significant rate of poverty. You have this growing class of poor peasants in China. At the same time, the sort of landholding class is starting to increasingly shrink in size. So you see these dramatic disparities in wealth in China. And it's into this situation that we see the British, especially, and other European powers trying to achieve a more favorable balance of trade with China. British merchants still are wanting goods from China, and they were not able to achieve very easily in the 1700s a favorable balance of trade because the only good they possessed that the Chinese really seemed to want was silver, and they didn't have enough of it. And so in order to achieve a more favorable balance of trade with China, British merchants turned to another good that the Chinese were increasingly interested in, and that was opium. So opium is grown in the British colony of India, and it's being shipped from India to Chinese ports by British merchants. So British merchants are going to pick up opium and they're bringing it to Chinese ports, Canton, and then ultimately opium is spreading from there. By some estimates, as many as like 90% of the Chinese male population in a few of these port cities were addicted to smoking opium. So in response to this, the Chinese emperor realizes that this practice needs to stop. And so in 1839, the Qing emperor bans the opium trade. The Chinese confiscated a number of the chests of opium and they destroyed those by dumping it into the river. Not surprising, this is going to anger the British and they're going to want revenge. And so what the British do is they ultimately attack the Chinese and initiate the first of a series of what are known as the Opium Wars. Now, who's going to win this conflict? You have Britain, who is industrialized, you have China, who's more of an agrarian society, And whenever you see that kind of a lineup in a war, you know that the industrial power is ultimately going to prevail. And so there's evidence that the weapons the Chinese were using were monkeys with fireworks attached to them. Meanwhile, the British had these massive cannons on board their ships. And so ultimately, the British are able to defeat the Chinese due to the British's superior military technology. Now, at this point, the British really have an option. Do they want to go in and fully conquer and politically control and colonize China? That seems like a lot of work. And their primary interest in China was trade. So what did they want the Chinese to do? They wanted the Chinese to sign a treaty at the end of this war, a trade treaty, an unequal trade treaty, opening Chinese ports up to British merchants. Because remember, at this point, the Chinese were trying to restrict the flow of trade to just Canton. And this opens up a whole nother can of worms, because then you have all sorts of other both Western powers and Russia and Japan starting to rush in to try and take control of various Chinese ports. So you can see here the British had controlled area along the Yangtze River. The British were also in Hong Kong. The French were in southern China. The Chinese were in Taiwan and some of the areas around Taiwan. And so the French, the Russians, the Germans, the Japanese also established spheres of influence. That is, again, a term referring to a form of economic imperialism. If you are the Qing and you've just lost a war, a series of wars against the British, that's not going to look very good in the eyes of the people. And so we're going to see the Han Chinese increasingly seeing the Manchus, these foreigners, as having lost the mandate of heaven. So whenever we see Chinese dynasty losing, or at least having been seen as having lost the mandate of heaven, what almost automatically follows? Lots of rebellions. So China then starts experiencing a number of internal rebellions. One that's of particular importance is one led by a guy named Hung Juquan, known as the Taiping Rebellion. And the story of Han Juquan is actually pretty interesting. He had failed the civil service exam system. He tried to take it again, and clearly Confucianism just wasn't his thing. So instead, he decided to find Jesus in his life. He converts to Christianity after reading the Bible, and he then has a dream claiming to be the younger brother of Jesus. So he makes this assertion that in his dream he was told by God that he was the younger brother of Jesus. And he starts this essentially Christian cult. And there's lots of diasporic Christian communities because of Jesuit missionary activity in China. And so this rebellion breaks out in China from 1850 to 1864. And it's really a sort of peasant-driven rebellion. And Hung Juquan was calling for some pretty radical changes. Radical changes such as abolishing private property. Who would that appeal to? Not surprisingly, it's the lower class, the peasants in China. And he also is suggesting replacing Neo-Confucianism with Christianity. He also has a number of other radical proposals, like, for example, allowing for greater gender equality. But then he also does some weird things, like ensuring that men and women had to be separate within their society. Ultimately, we're going to see this aspect of some peasants pushing for radical change, including the abolition of private property, but ultimately it's not going to succeed in the Taiping Rebellion. It's not going to succeed until the 1940s with the success of the Chinese Communist Revolution. In terms of the impacts of the Taiping Rebellion, it is dramatic. We think about the global conflicts in world history that led to the greatest number of deaths. Number one is World War II, 60 million people who died. The Mongol conquest in China and Persia and Russia resulted in approximately 50 million people dying. The Taiping Rebellion, a conflict that very few people have ever heard of, in the West at least, 45 million people died in this Taiping Rebellion. So the Taiping Rebellion, because it's just a rebellion, ultimately failed. But it also weakened the Qing Dynasty. This is just one more arrow that's striking the Qing at a time when they're already weakened. So in response to the Taiping Rebellion, the Chinese and the Qing, the Manchus, recognize we have to make some changes. We have to modernize. We have to industrialize. And so the Qing rulers adopt a number of reform policies. known collectively as self-strengthening. And the goal is somewhat similar to what we saw in Japan, right? We want to modernize, we want to industrialize. The one major difference, though, is Japan really went all in, right? They went in with Western culture, they engaged in rapid state-sponsored industrialization, whereas in China, there wasn't that same kind of all-in attitude possessed by the Chinese. And that's probably not surprising, right? Because the Chinese were very hesitant about not giving up the things that have worked so well for China, right? Those sort of traditional Confucian values. And so China is, again, always more of sort of a backwards looking society, looking to what has worked in the past to try and use that to their success. But they're not always the most innovative and forward-looking society, and that might help explain why, on the one hand, Japan was more successful with their Meiji Restoration. The self-strengthening policies of the Chinese ultimately were a failure. So some evidence of how self-strengthening failed. Well, for one thing, in China today, in Beijing, you can find a boat made of marble, created by the empress at the time, Empress Sisi. And if you think about the physics of it, marble and boat, yeah, those things don't go together. And so, not surprisingly, this is a good example of something that rulers have been doing throughout world history to legitimize their power by building cool stuff. But is a marble boat going to do anything? No, it's never even moved. It's not even a boat. It's actually just stationary. And think about it going up against gunboats of industrial nations. It's not useful. And so not surprising in 1895 when the Chinese go to war against the Japanese in the Sino-Japanese War, it is ultimately the Japanese who are victorious. In 1898, yet another rebellion breaks out in northern China this time. It's known as the Boxer Rebellion. And the Boxers were also a very interesting cult-like group. Their technical name is the Society for the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. They were very into kung fu. They thought that by doing certain physical exercises, they could somehow become bulletproof, which is not in fact the case. But this is an example of another anti-imperialist movement. We've seen a few of these now in period 5, such as the Sepoy Rebellion and the Anglo-Zulu War. In this case, the Boxers wanted to remove both Western and Japanese influence from China. They were not happy about the spheres of influence that had been asserted by the British and the Germans and the French. They were not happy about Japanese influence in China. They wanted foreigners out. It was an anti-foreign rebellion. Now, interestingly enough, the Qing, who were incredibly weak, were having a hard time putting this rebellion down. And so guess who they turned to help them put the rebellion down? None other than those Western powers. So the West, including the United States, Britain, Japan, were called upon to help crush the rebellion, which just adds further proof to this idea that self-strengthening as a policy was not working. So by 1911, now that we're in period 6, we have yet another rebellion in China. This one ultimately succeeds. It leads to the revolution, the end of the Qing Dynasty, and also, sadly, the 2,000-year-old dynasty system in China, because the government that will take power following the collapse of the Qing Dynasty is a republic, and then later in period 6 we'll see Mao Zedong and the communists rise to power. So as a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer this question about the problems faced by China in the 19th century and how they ultimately responded. And you should be able to start to identify some of the similarities and differences between China and Japan's response to industrialization in the 19th century. Thanks for watching.